Hi everyone, and welcome again to my audiovisual channel. I am Gabriela Handal, a draftsman and the host of the show, A Conversation About Art. During each episode, I look for the meaning of art and beauty through conversations with colleagues in different artistic fields. Today, I bring you episode 50, and I will have this conversation with a total badass artist, Michael Grimaldi. I think it's pretty cool that several of those decade episodes have had pretty cool people in them. And it's pretty cool that halfway to 100, I get to talk to Michael Grimaldi. Pretty cool. If you'd like to support this podcast, liking and sharing this video is a great way to do it, and so is subscribing. These forms of support are immediate and have no additional cost. If you want to support the podcast with money, this is also an option and quite welcome. And you can do so by purchasing my drawings directly from my website, buying stuff I make from eBay, buying prints of my drawings, or leaving a tip. The links for these things are in the show notes. Thank you very much for watching and or listening, whichever one you may be doing, and enjoy the episode. All right, Michael Grimaldi, welcome to my podcast, A Conversation About Art. You are episode 50. Please tell our listeners and viewers who you are and what you do.
Well, hello. Hi, Gabriela. It's good to see you again. I'm Michael Grimaldi. I'm an artist, a visual artist, primarily doing monochromatic works on paper, things like that. And I teach drawing and anatomy at the New York Academy of Art, where I'm the director of the drawing and the anatomy departments. And that's about it.
Okay, that's great. Has there always been an anatomy department? There must have been, right?
Yeah, I think from the very beginning at the Academy, it was kind of spearheaded by Martha Erlbacher and Walter Erlbacher, I believe, and then and just kind of continued on as a huge part of the curriculum there.
Okay.
So, and as you know, as an alum of the school, you know, anatomy is a huge part of everybody's training there. Regardless of their discipline, and then there are anatomy tracks and things like that. So
yes, yeah, okay. I am curious about the way you described your work, which was monochromatic. Which is, I mean, I'm aware of that. You know, it's a grayscale work, but there's no mention of a medium. So I'd like it if you talked a little bit about the mediums that you employ to make the work.
So I think in the very beginning, the work I was doing when I was kind of transitioning from painting and color and things like that were primarily, if not exclusively, just graphite on paper kind of things. It was a material that was very familiar to me. You know, it's familiar to everybody. We all grow up with pencils in our hands, whether we're writing or drawing or sketching and things like that. And so it was just the material that I gravitated towards the most, and because of its kind of versatility. You know, it has certain limitations and things in terms of like the value structure of it isn't the same as charcoal. You know, it doesn't go to jet black. It's a little bit more of a nuanced iridescent gray, but you have a great deal of control over it. You have a great deal of like selection in terms of like hardness and how much kaolin is mixed in with the graphite and changing its attributes, and then the different substrates affect its outlook, right? Or its outcome. And then I think more recently, probably in the last like 6 or 7 years, something like that, when you start working at when I started working at larger and larger scales, you start realizing really what the problems are with the material. You know, it's fantastic for nuances, as I was kind of mentioning. And then, so I started kind of incorporating a lot of different, somewhat experimental. It turns out they're not, you know, it's not like a brand new thing, but mixing like alcohol into powder graphite, things like that. So you kind of, it's a little bit like a tattoo on the paper. It sort of stains in using capillary action. So it's not like a true paint. It doesn't have a binder. It uses the graphite as its own binder. And so that started kind of, I guess, broadening the capabilities of the material. And then I gradually started just incorporating more and more different things, you know, spray paint into things, spray enamel. like if you kind of want to reduce a drawing back to, it's almost like the starting point, spraying on like white enamel on it will practically remove the entire thing, but it'll kind of restart the substrate again. Like it gives you like potentially a little bit more tooth. And then recently I started working a lot with kind of like just mixed media things, you know, like if you're laying in a painting, it can go really, really quickly, regardless of the scale, using wet media, like oil paint or acrylic or something like that. Graphite drawings and even charcoal drawings to a certain extent, it's not as sort of fond of being set up really rapidly in the beginning, you know, but the final execution goes relatively rapidly. So started kind of incorporating into like charcoal to kind of get a little bit of a wider value scale. And then as I was doing that, kind of using black acrylics and things like that to kind of work the background or the sort of underdrawing up a little bit more rapidly, using like mixed things like pumice, mixing that into like clear matte medium as sort of an intermediate layer, and then you can work drawing on top of it again, and chalks and all sorts of things. So, which is kind of fun because it took a lot of the formality out of and the kind of predictability out of the construction of drawings. Like there's a certain point where all of us become, I think, relatively familiar with our material, you know, and it's kind of nice every once in a while to just like kind of shock the structure of that, and just like, I have no idea how this is going to behave, see what happens. Right.
Okay. Okay. Yes. So, all right. How long have you been drawing, making art?
Oh boy, since as long as I could remember. I didn't really call it art. It was just like, it's what kids do, right? It's a way of just kind of interpreting the world and imagining spaces and just kind of like daydreaming and all that kind of thing. So I was doing it a lot. I guess I started focusing a little bit more when I was in elementary school and junior high school and things like that on science and biology and things like that. And so drawing just became part of that process. If you're documenting a dissection of a frog or something like that, or trying to draw the difference between, a ciliate and a flagellate or some type of amoeba or something like that, you can draw it through a microscope. And then I guess my my kind of intention was, when I went to high school, it was kind of partially going into architecture. So there was architectural rendering and perspective and things like that. But I was gravitating more and more towards special effects, thinking I wanted to go into making models for, the special effects industry. But at the time I was like, right when I was kind of leaving high school, it was becoming more and more increasingly digital, right? Which wasn't so as interesting to me. And it was the very early days of digital rendering and things like that. We didn't have things like Procreate and ZBrush and stuff like that.
Do you remember what the programs were?
I don't, because I was never really, besides computer aided drafting, which was used occasionally, CAD and things like that, which is used occasionally in architectural rendering at the time, but it was even pre-Photoshop. Like Photoshop didn't exist at the time either. So I went to the Art Students League to try to, the studio school and the Art Students League, just to kind of develop a portfolio, thinking, that I'd go to Cooper Union, that kind of thing. And then just really kind of got into the fine arts thing and just never really looked back. So.
Wait, so then why did you go to the Art Students League at first?
It was just by chance. I took a summer class at the New York Studio School and really loved the kind of immersive environment. They had a program called the Drawing Marathon, and where you're drawing like just 12 hours a day from a live model, which I'd never experienced before, still life setups, all that kind of stuff. So it was hyper intensive. At the time, the school was much more, had a focus on work that was a little bit more expressionistic. And I don't think I was really mature enough, being at the age of 17, to really appreciate, the things I might appreciate now, like the, extraordinary work of Matisse and things like that, or Giacometti. I was kind of gravitating a little bit more towards, earlier work like Ribera and Rubens and Michelangelo and stuff. And one of the students there said, you know what, you should check out this place. Here's a catalog for this place called the Art Students League, which I'd never heard of before, up on 57th Street. And I went up there and just studied for the next, on and off. Great thing about the Art Students League is that you can drop in, you can drop out, you can go back to it. So I was there on and off, I guess, for 6 years, and then ended up teaching there for like an 11-year stint before starting up at the academy. So
okay. So what do you think, what was it about drawing the figure and like that sort of arguably traditional atelier feeling there that you think was, why do you think you stuck around and just everything else is just forgotten, basically?
Yeah, it was, it's a really intense question. And I kind of look back at this a lot because I have a mixed sort of feeling about, like, as any artist kind of dealing with figuration and stuff like that, it's got a lot of baggage. It has a lot of historical baggage. It has a lot of, things that it does. I think at the time I was really just, it felt like part of a legacy. Like the work that I knew was the work of Da Vinci, and, things from looking through art history books and seeing the power of the potential of human expression via the figure, right, just seemed huge. I think when I was leaving the, and you're along the way, you're just learning all sorts of subtleties and big, broad aspects of work. And then you're also being exposed to a lot of different paintings, drawings, representations throughout history. And so it's a huge subject matter that seems to have no beginning and no end. Figurative art, the earliest pieces that we see in the caves of Lascaux and the Chauvet caves, they're figurative and representations of the human figure within that. And it seems, like it never really stopped. So, and then I like when one, I think, leaves school, and especially a disciplined school like the Art Students League, right? So by disciplined, it's an atelier type of program made up of 50 or however many different ateliers, different teachers are running classes. They're intensive in terms of the time that you have in front of with instruction, but also in front of the model. And then I think as one starts leaving, at least in my case, it was like, well, now what? What do you do with this? You have a certain degree of skill, you have skill sets, you have the ability to sort of draw representationally to a certain extent, right? And then it starts becoming an imperative to figure out what that language is. Why are you doing this? Those tough existential questions, right? Why am I waking up in the morning, and why do I feel an urge to do this? What can I do with this beyond what I was doing, in a formal class, in a formal classroom environment, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah. And it kind of makes me think a little bit about, I'm not that familiar with atelier study, like I sort of am, like I have an idea, you draw your casts a million times and this kind of stuff, like the figure, very disciplined and following specific steps, methods of drawing and stuff. But it makes me think of, like, I guess the impression that I have of that sort of study, that perhaps lots of times the students end up just having that be their visual language in their work. And like for me at least, and it might just mean that my eye isn't that refined in terms of looking at that kind of work. But I often have a hard time differentiating. I also don't look that much at, like that type of work. So I think it is in large part my own unrefined eyes, I guess, just because I haven't collected that much in my image bank of that stuff. But I mean, is that what you mean? Is that what you mean with, you know, you yourself breaking out what I do beyond this, you know, because, you know, it arguably becomes like the style basically of the person, like atelier, it looks all the same. So like, did you have something like that? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, to a certain extent. And on another level, I was sort of spared that in some ways at the Art Students League because, you know, it's sort of, the world wasn't really like having the formalized atelier type models that we have now, that the world has now, you know. So the league was a place where it's sort of atelier style training in some ways, but there's no like mandatory thing where you're drawing casts for a year before you're going to the figure, and then you're drawing for a year before you start painting the figure, you know. Because it was the Art Students League, it also had a lot of the, you know, the Ashcan school in it. It's kind of a bunch of just rogue people, and so the students and my contemporaries, the people that were studying there, we would go from one school to the other. Like, you know, we might be in something that was a little bit more of a formalized atelier, and then we'd kind of go back to the Art Students League or to the National Academy of Design, or go to the School of Visual Arts to just audit classes and things like that. You know, so it was a little bit more freeform anyway. I don't think my training was as structured as a lot of the ateliers that you start seeing, like, this is what your first year looks like, you know, that kind of thing. It was a little bit more like you're just kind of thrown in when you first start in a situation like that, alongside somebody that might have been drawing for, you know, well, if it's the Art Students League, they might be these outstanding, crazy illustrators that have been working for 25 years, and, you know, and their work is amazing, and you learn a lot from them. So it's a little bit less of the thing that I see with, you know, if you're really entrenched in an atelier, that I think the danger is that you have one teacher, you have one sort of methodology that's trained into you, and then along the way, the aesthetics start falling into it. Like you were saying, it becomes its own language. It becomes a language for the people that have been sort of indoctrinated into that situation. So, yeah. But even just on a bigger level, like, I think when you're drawing a model on the model stand, and then something like that has no context, or you're drawing a still life simply for its technical things, like, you know, oh, I haven't drawn a metal object before, so let me do that, right? That's what's dictating your subject matter. And then you start realizing, do I like these objects, first of all? Second of all, am I thinking about composition? Is there a more compelling way of looking at form or content, you know? And then when you get out of school, that's when the fun stuff starts happening, and the really frustrating stuff as well.
Yeah, of course, but the best and the worst stuff.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I can't say that I think about it very often or anything, but occasionally it does come up in the conversations. I don't know, like this pairing of like the traditional atelier study versus just other figurative study, but not necessarily traditional atelier study. Because like, I don't think I would enjoy a traditional atelier type, like what you said just now of a year of drawing only casts. I think I might kill myself.
Oh yeah.
Especially because like at the academy, I mean, it's not like I didn't try it, because I did try it at the academy with Roberta Ossi. That was, but because for drawing majors, cast drawing is mandatory, and I do think it's important to at least try to do it well.
Right.
But we did site size for one class, and I was like in tears, close to tears, because I was so fucking angry and frustrated doing this method. And, you know, it might also just be because I'm just like not used to it, because I was like my first time in my life ever doing it. And it's like really very rigid I mean, in a way it's rigid comparatively to like just drawing a thing and erasing as many times as you have to, and you make the line again and again. I mean, I don't know. So because it's just that, I mean, I'm aware of the utility of that kind of study, like really, rigid sounds like it's a negative thing, but like, I don't know, dedicated and very studious and I don't know, scientific in a way,
Right.
of that stuff. And the Academy was indeed founded by Andy Warhol, who felt he lacked that kind of foundational stuff. So like that's why he wanted to have that school. So it's like I often wonder, where is the balance so that there is like that foundational study, but it doesn't end up becoming like that trap where
Totally.
where the artist seems to have a really hard time breaking out of that stylistic atelier look. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, I think in a lot of ways, sometimes it's even a semantic difference, like if you're looking at something like, okay, here's a methodology that we're going to do, site size or whatever method, kind of thing. It immediately sort of imposes kind of like a task thing, with very little room to maneuver out of, right? I think if you kind of present the same ideas, the same concepts behind it, approaches to doing something, but you're kind of identifying them as strategies rather than a technique or an approach to something, it becomes a little bit more like, oh, okay, this is interesting. If I do this, it's easier to judge proportion. If I do this, it's easier for me to look at composition. If I look at this, so it's almost like you have many, many different components that you become, if not absolutely expert at, you're sort of familiar with something that then allows you to free form kind of construct a drawing, and you become very thoughtful in the experience, I think. And I don't mean thoughtful in a way where it becomes limiting, but actually thoughtful in a way where it really expands the way that you're kind of examining your subject or the way that you're working. You see what I mean? Because you sort of mix and match things, and then you're just like, well, what if I did this? What if, like, when you get out of school after you've learned from, X number of different primary teachers, that kind of thing, you're like, what if I kind of incorporate these two things at the same time? And so you end up with a great deal of versatility, I think. And I think that that's the benefit of something like that, right? And then, the drawback of it is that when I think creativity is taken out of it, like if you have a student and it becomes just like, this is toil, like you have to do this drawing of this cast or this model from this point of view here, this kind of thing. And if you are ever uninspired by that, that is more damaging than anything that you're going to gain from that experience, if that makes sense, right? And then so then, a lot of times that was the kind of neat thing about the Art Students League, or, any of the institutions, like at the academy, at wherever, you have the ability to kind of like gravitate towards maybe people that are sort of, you have a better rapport with, or the working method doesn't seem as foreign or absurd, frankly, so.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No. I see what you're saying. So it's like it's cool as a foundational study sort of thing, but it's I mean, I think this is what I understood from what you're saying. If perhaps it's better taught as a tool for learning something, a tool along the way, more than like a definitive, this is how you paint or this is how you draw, and then that's kind of it.
Yeah. And I think just even reinforcing that and then shaking it up too, I think the responsibility of an educator too is to just be like, hey, now that we've sort of done this a couple of times, let's do the opposite. Let's just totally deconstruct the experience, see what, how can you turn this into your own language, or how can you look at things a little bit differently, right? So, I mean, and in a lot of ways, it's similar to the whole thing with the materials that we're talking about a little while ago. It's like everything has a benefit and a hazard attached to it, right? And so you're just trying to figure out okay, maybe I'm aware of this and this becomes part of the structure, or its own limitations. Or what if you take those limitations and say, what if I change this up or shake it up enough so that I'm doing something completely unusual, right? So whether it's thought process or materials or, subject matter.
Yes. And all right, so yes, thank you for reminding me about the materials and what you were musing about earlier about how you use them. What would you say? What are the shortcomings of graphite that made you? I mean, but besides perhaps the value range, but still, if it'd be cool if you went more into that. Yeah, what would you say are the shortcomings of graphite that made you like reach for or want to experiment with other materials?
I guess, I guess it was just the, oh boy, if there's a kind of poetry to graphite that I really love, where
Mm,
like whether it's in the works of others, and kind of looking at a graphite drawing, there's such an unusual quality about it.
mm,
I mean, I think parts of it are, even its reflectivity, like that it sort of gets a little bit iridescent and weird. It has
mm,
such a dry kind of, um, very gritty sort of feel to me, which is, I think, one of the benefits.
mm,
I think from, if you kind of look at the rich saturation of like a Fritz Lang film or something like that, where it's really black and white and very graphic and very, or like a Kurosawa film, where it's very grainy in a lot of ways,
yeah.
you know, I think that just has a very different sort of section of that graphic language, of that monochromatic language, or the potentials of it, and then it affects the mood differently. I think,
Mm,
if you have, comparing different films, like if they're like one's a little bit more silvery in its tonality and then another one's a lot more graphic, what does that do to the mood within the work? And then I think, like, as if you're looking at the limitations of that, it's not like it's truly limited, but it does kind of conform, the kind of content and message of the work, you know. And so that's what I think the main limitation I was looking at. There are practical ones too. When you're working really large, if you have a 6-foot piece of paper and you're laying in enormous, just like dark areas and something, um, if you're using traditional graphite, that is, it could just be really labor intensive. And
mm,
I think if something becomes toil without the kind of feedback, the immediate feedback,
mm,
it sort of doesn't work for me. It's like, I'm restless and I want to see the work sort of evolve. I'd
mm.
rather than sit there like a drone
Yeah.
and, so.
Okay. Um, I had to ask you something again, just now. Oh, so you started making bigger works recently? Only recently?
No, I mean, part of my training too was one of the teachers I had, a person named Ron Scher, who's a portrait artist. He really sort of demanded sort of a, kind of pushing the boundaries of your familiar scale,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I had been working on relatively small things. 18 by 24 was about maximum,
Mm,
kind of thing. And then in his class, you were sort of expected to stretch a 62 by 45-inch canvas and do a painting every single 2 weeks. We'd have 2-week poses, right? And so you kind of get a very different sort of approach to things. And then as I started kind of moving back towards drawing, right, from painting, my scale started reducing again, right?
mm,
So it was kind of getting kind of smaller and smaller for practical reasons.
mm,
I mean, there were never like really tiny, like ultra small scale pieces, but still kind of limited to, I don't know, a yard by 2 feet or something like that.
mm,
Um, and then I think like wanting to kind of push it a little bit more into larger scales, like let's do a life-size figure and it just seemed like the traditional graphite thing, you kind of lost the speed of the execution, you started losing like the ability to really get your arm in it and sort of make a mess of it.
mm,
Even having the sort of chance occurrence of the material, because let's say by traditional graphite, I mean just like pencil to paper and that's about it. Maybe smudging it a little bit,
mm,
but let's not get too crazy here, right?
mm,
That kind of thing. Um, so much of that kind of chance occurrence, like the thing of having the material sort of dictate its own concerns, disappears, so or can be overly controlled by the artist. And so kind of bringing in other materials, like larger scale things, or using wet material where, whoops, there's a drip, but then what are you going to do now? It starts kind of creating its own sort of life and has its own existence that starts dictating back to you, what its necessities are. Because, also growing up when I did, New York was really always balancing this world of figuration and abstraction, Bob Rauschenberg and, on one hand, and then you had like Robert Longo on the other hand, and you had like all these kind of different sort of things that never seemed to be completely at odds with each other. It was, you know what I mean? And so like you're exposed as much to abstract expressionism as you are to representational work. I think that was one of the other things that also kind of going back to the sort of atelier thing that made me, I think, a little bit more resistant from going into a fully structured, let's do cast drawing for 2 years, that type of thing. Because that wasn't what art was to me. Art was a lot broader. It was, it was as much, Philip Pearlstein as it was Robert Rauschenberg and Jackson Pollock, right? So.
Okay. All right. So in that case, what is art, though?
Yeah. Well, beats the heck out of me. I mean, it's so vast that I don't think it can really kind of create an answer, except that it's, something that I think brings us insight into ourselves and into the human condition, whether that's musical art, whether it's theater art, if it's film, if it's visual art, all that kind of thing. An effective art piece to me, right? Whatever its medium is something that evokes thought and empathy and, a feeling where you walk out of a theater after looking at a picture, knowing something a little bit more about humanity and what its potentials are,
Okay. How do you think it does? How do you think it does that? How do you think art brings insight to ourselves and humans?
Well, I think it gives us an ability to look at the world through someone's eyes other than our own, and to experience an experience other than ones that we've actually experienced. If that makes sense, it's a way to kind of muse and ponder and sort of visit worlds that we'd never fathom, and then through that communication, it's just, you're tapping into something that very familiar, you're very familiar with on an emotional level. I mean, thinking about anything where it's a stretch, let's say like science fiction or something like that, or ultra experimental, electronic music that was very foreign to many of us in the, before the 90s or something like that. Like what I think it effectively does is kind of, it shows you still its own structure. I don't mean some sort of like rigid, predictable structure, but I mean a structure of emotion, a structure of a feeling that you have within that landscape, whatever that landscape is.
Okay. I really like what you said just now about how art is a way to muse and ponder. It reminds me a little bit of writing, except that because when you're writing, one is writing something, you're like writing down the idea and then being like, oh, well, what can I add to this, or what does this mean, or what if I do this or that and stuff. And then it's like with visual art, at least, or perhaps even with music, one does something similar where say like fantasy art, and it's like, what would it be like if a person had wings,
right,
for example? And it's like an idea that one plays with on the paper, like with the image and stuff. Do you think I want to talk a bit more about what you said about provoking thought and evoking emotion. Do you think that the thought that is provoked by the work of art and the emotion, do you think that that it can be any emotion, any thought, and then that's good enough for the work, or does it have to be thought and emotion that makes the viewer feel better or reconsider something, or what kind of range of thought and emotion do you think is, I don't know.
No, I think it runs the gamut. I mean, you take something that's very uplifting. I can't offhand think of a picture or a movie or something that I really gravitate to that's like uplifting, that makes you feel better immediately because because that's the kind of manifest image. Like sometimes if you have, I'm thinking about like some of the great books that I've read, or paintings that I've seen, or sculptures, that kind of thing, is it really comes in through a back door, through something that's a little bit different. Like, taking an Anselm Kiefer painting, for instance. I mean, there's just such a sense of kind of existential dread, at least my interpretation of it is filled with, facing fear and facing like some sort of, the sublime of looking at a landscape that's so vast that you could barely comprehend your own scale within it, if that makes sense, But then through that, I think I have an uplifting experience. I think I experience something that profoundly kind of alters or touches on something that I feel, so. And I think, because oftentimes too, if you look at it from, not that there's like really a clinical aspect to painting and drawing and sculpture and things like that, but you're kind of bringing up something that you might have left dormant, like some aspect of something that you might want to deal with, you don't deal with on a level until you see it expressed through somebody else's hand, or through their eye, or through the sounds that they make, if that makes sense, right?
Okay. Would you say that's a little bit maybe like, especially this last part, when a piece of a work can make a person feel something that they have never experienced before? Do you think it's just that it reminded me a little bit of the Greek catharsis? Like when you see a tragedy and it's like, I've never experienced. I've never been a mother who killed her child, for example. Right. So like that, like is it something like that?
Yeah, I think so.
Does that apply also?
Yeah, and I think in a lot of ways, like, but it's something that you could imagine. It's like something that you could, and I think why you will have that cathartic experience with a work, regardless of it being something that you've experienced or not, is because it taps into something that you know that you could experience, that that you could sort of drive into, right?
Yeah.
Or participate in. I mean, all of film noir sort of operates on that level. It's like, yeah, we're not like murderous bank robbers, but you know what? Part of us is, or part of us wants to be,
Okay.
Part of us wants to kind of fantasize within that. And then we have a moralistic lesson afterwards. It's like, yeah, maybe it's good to just not be. Right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I see what you mean. I like that a lot. It reminds me of, I don't remember the author of the book, and I haven't read the book. I know only of the book. I think it's called Ordinary Men or something. I think it's something about just regular people. And I know of that book, which, I would like to read through a guy who's a lecturer now. His name is Jordan Peterson, and he recommends the book because it does that very thing that you're saying. In that, so the book is about, and again, I haven't read it. That's like the gist of the book. The book is about these guys during I think Nazi Germany or something, that they were just like regular ass guys, just regular people or something of the sort, and they were taken to the camps to do something. And like over time, they turned out just as bad. They turned out doing just exactly the terrible things that the Nazi guards were doing. So like the point of the book and a lot of the point of the message that Jordan Peterson talks about really very often is that very thing, is that the capability that we every single individual person, everyone has the capability to do just everything within the gamut of what humans can do. And so like whether you end up doing it or not, it depends on lots of things. It depends on the circumstances. It depends on just all the you cannot count the variables. The thing is that it's possible that everyone can do the worst thing or the best thing or a normal thing or whatever. It's like the capability to do everything is like within everyone. And I think that's a really good thing to associate with art, because I think we have to be reminded of that really quite as often as possible. Yeah,
totally. Yeah, there's a book by Wilhelm Reich, who's a student of Carl Jung, I believe, and he wrote this book called The Mass Psychology of Fascism, which is really asking the same question. Being of German descent, how does an entire structure of civilized societal, people with children and empathy and all that kind of stuff, how do they conform to some, the mass psychosis, and yeah, I think as artists, and then you have artists like, I think especially as I mentioned before, like Anselm Kiefer or Gerhard Richter, what they're kind of doing is almost examining that from a point of view and then kind of making you deal with it again, generations after those atrocities. And then there's kind of an undercurrent that sort of reminds us of our past and our capabilities as human beings, and then ironically, I think that to read a picture, it takes empathy, it's like, it takes a sort of empathetic, ability to kind of join within that on a level that really understands and participates. So.
Yes, I do quite enjoy that. What we were talking about just now as part of something that art does or can do, at least.
Yeah.
Because there was another thing similar to this about somebody like a teacher. I wish I had more exact things, because otherwise it sounds like I'm just making it up, but I'm not. I listened to it in a podcast or something, and there was this teacher that is asking his students if they lived, I don't know, this year or last year, whatever, our time recently, asking their students, like, if they lived during, either in Nazi Germany or just like any of these even tragedies that are currently happening, in other situations, like in China or whatever. It's like, wait, I guess talking about them as in the past is better because you remove like the modernity of it. So yeah, like, slavery in the United States, whatever. It's like, do you think that if asking the students, do you think that if you were during the abolition time or whatever, or like ideas of abolition or whatever, do you think that you would have, because at the time when that stuff was just coming up, it was like, I don't know, practically rebellious to do so.
Yeah.
So that question to the students was, do you think that you would have spoken in favor of abolition? And they're like, yeah, of course I would, and whatever. And it's like, no, you wouldn't have.
Right.
No, you wouldn't have. Because it's not that easy to speak about something that few people talk about, and that might be talked down upon at the time or something. It's not, it's very likely that whomever would have indeed participated of what they criticize now in the present, whomever they are, whatever it is that they're criticizing of, it's very possible that in another circumstance they would be participating of what they're criticizing. And it's like, I find very frustrating that people forget that. It's like we want to pretend as if we're wholly good, or otherwise it's like you're just wholly evil. And it's like, that is really not how we work. It's like both are within each individual. The individual is a whole, and the whole contains both things.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So then what is beauty in your opinion?
Well, yeah, I was almost prompted because, you know, when we're texting each other before about, you know, came up, sort of knew that this was going to be part of that.
Mm.
On one level, I have no idea, but I think like thinking about it, I think it just kind of goes back to the art thing. Like it can be something that is very unconventional. It can be something that does not conform to a concept, an overreaching concept or a, traditional concept of beauty, but something that evokes an emotional response, and so I guess that's what, I mean, a couple of months ago, I was watching the movie Seven, right? Is it David Fincher, I believe.
Oh, I don't know who the director is.
Yeah, I might be wrong about that. But anyway, it's such a beautiful film and it is so hideous, right? It's supposed to be hideous. It's supposed to like even challenge the idea of like what good and evil is on a lot of the levels. And then there's this hypnotic, just sort of aesthetic to it, right? That is so beautiful, like the use of green in that film and just like where everything looks like the color of bile is so like profoundly beautiful. And I think, I think it's incomprehensible. I've had experiences where I was traveling across the Pyrenees and looking up at the rock face and down at a raging river that's just etched for centuries this thing, and had this profound feeling of beauty or the sublime, and then this is going to sound strange, but like I remember being at Ground Zero a month after 9/11 and having a very similar experience, like the way that the twisted metal and the sodium arc lamps were lighting up the scene and there was still smoke. There was something that was so obviously horrific kind of thing, but you tap into something that is visually arresting, right? It's off-putting on every level. It makes you terrified of your own sense of smallness, right, within the universe, by experiencing something great, but also had this profound sense of that sublime, of the beautiful, of the, it's like looking across the Grand Canyon on one level, if that makes sense. So when it comes down to like beauty is like one of those words that people love to avoid because, oftentimes it sort of has a trite connotation to it, or something that's about, the prettiness of something, or its vapidness almost defines its beauty. But like, I look at beauty as something that is that moment where your heart skips a beat and you have that experience where you bow down in awe of something. And whatever brings that on, if it's looking at in a child's eyes, if it's looking at a painting, if it's seeing an amazing film, or, the last page of the book that you have just been reading that you never want to end, it's so.
Okay. What do you mean with what does sublime mean?
I mean, something that just kind of gives you a sense of, in my case, I think a sense of dread, or a sense of like, in a lot of ways, a sense of awe of your own, like that smallness of each human as an individual, but then as collective, we're vast, right? Or the world is vast while we're standing in one very small moment of time within that. Looking up at a star-filled night, it's like, I think I experienced the sublime. It's just like you're looking at something and, oh my gosh, I think that's Mars. And I think if that's Mars, that's got to be Jupiter. And then you're thinking about the distance between you and these objects, and, and wondering, like, thinking about the earliest hominids on this planet. We're looking up at a moon that looked very similar to the one that we're seeing up there. And, So for me, that's what the sublime is. And I think like when a piece of art sort of experiences that, when you have that sort of moment with something, and even when you revisit it, like, you know, you see a painting when you're 15 years old and it blows you away. And then you see it again when you're 25 years old and it kind of blows you away on a totally different level. And then you see it again at 45, and then, you know, on and on. And the piece kind of grows with you. You realize like its own expansiveness, its own greatness, right?
Yes.
Which I think is, you know, something that I just love that about art. Or, you know, when you see that in a painting, you know, if you see it in, you know, in a film, I just think it's a profound thing. It reaches the sublime. So
yes, what you were saying just now about looking at a piece of work throughout one's life reminded me of something that's been mentioned a handful of times in previous episodes, about how a piece of work, you know, like when we look at one of Da Vinci's drawings, like in person, that's like time traveling. So like the object, the drawing or whatever, has time traveled, and in a way it has, you know, it's gonna live much longer than the person, than any one of us, because, you know, our lifespan is really relatively short, even when we make it to 100 years or whatever. But then that connection with the sublime is really cool, because indeed it's like, because, you know, like when you involve time and the fact that the object of art is like defying time in a way because it persists for so long. It's like, that is, you know, like being able to put that beside like an analog in a way to looking up at the stars. That's really cool. And speaking of looking up at the stars, there's a video, I don't know if it's still up on YouTube, but it's about an image that the Hubble took. It's called the Hubble Deep Field, the Hubble Ultra Deep Field or something. And so do you know about this?
I do, yeah.
Yeah, and so like they had the Hubble staring at a spot towards the universe for like 11 days, I think it was, or like 2 weeks or something. And every single little bit of light there, some are bigger and clearer than the others. They're all like galaxies. They're all galaxies. It's like crazy. I just remember the first time that I saw it, and, you know, this was years ago too, decades. I don't know like how many years ago it was, but it was a very long time ago. And every time when I watch it, it's like I either cry, get goosebumps or stuff because of what you were saying of the sublime. And it's like, we are so minuscule in the face of whatever size the universe is, that it's like, I guess that realization every so often, I guess, whenever we're reminded of that our problems or like whatever things we think are important, it's really in a way not. They're not. It's like
totally. If I'm not convoluting different sort of images from Hubble and the other space telescopes, that spot was actually chosen because it sort of looked like it was a void. Like there was like a star region, then there's like a little pocket, you know, and they're like, let's like look into that pocket there and see what's there. And then it's like sort of realizing that you have this frame of reference that is like this, that's really like just goes on and on. And then you're looking into that, and then you just see a whole other expanse, which is, I mean, just mind numbing. But then like even bringing it back to the timelessness or the time travel thing, it's remarkable to me that you like, when you look at a piece of artwork, you know, whether it's like the cave paintings in Lascaux or something, where these images are speaking to you, you know, or, you know, the Madonna and Saint Anne cartoon, the Da Vinci piece, or even like, you know, if it's literature, if it's like Herman Melville's Moby Dick or something like that, it's like such a specific little weird thing. It's like a whaling voyage, and, you know, these characters and experience I've certainly never had. How does that not only speak to you as a human, but then also how does it not become dated? How does it not, you know, how does it move forward throughout history, you know? And I think even bringing it back to the whole sort of atelier thing that we're talking about in the very beginning, I think that is potentially one of the hugest problems of it, is that the when you're like ultra traditional, what you're doing is you're kind of looking back to the past and wanting your work to be able to time travel, but backwards, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to just being like, you're doing work that is really about where you are at any time, and then it works and it does that time travel to the future, you know. So
Yes.
it's
Yes.
that
Okay.
makes
Yeah.
sense.
That's like a more refined version of like the what we were talking about, the getting
Right.
stuck in the, I mean, confusing the study and I mean the study becoming like the visual language and the style of the person. Yeah, that's like a more
Yeah.
refined way of saying that.
Or fetishizing like the past to a point where it defines a language, you know, that
Yeah.
might be a language that really is not. Of course there are going to be human conditions that were, you know, like Christopher Marlowe or Shakespeare or Herman Melville or Paul Auster or, you know, writers throughout history. They're all dealing with very similar elements, but, you know, I think the element is that their work really, of course there's something that's human about it, and an experience that you're going to share, we as a collective are going to share, but then not like going back to that and just having a past style dictate, you know, the formal execution, which I think kind of precludes its own ability to communicate, you know, in a lot of ways.
Yes. But. Okay. Well, Mr. Grimaldi, we have reached the 55-minute mark of this lovely conversation. And so I like what you were saying just now to finish, start closing it out. So, Michael, please tell our viewers and listeners what you're up to lately, where your work can be found. Do you have any upcoming projects you're excited about or something like this?
Yeah, right. So right now it's sort of a transitionary period. Like I'm revamping my website, so that's currentently down and in under construction and things like that. It should be up pretty soon. I've been working for the last couple of years, probably since the beginning of COVID, on a series that I'm sort of working title is The Decameron, sort of based on the book The Decameron, which took place during the plague years and the Renaissance. And it's basically a bunch of people that go and leave town and start telling stories. And so I started doing this body of work sort of very, very loosely based on that. Just the idea of like, how do you contend with isolation? What are the kind of inner yearnings of people during periods of social isolation? What do they dream about? What do they imagine? You know, that kind of thing. So it's a series of very small, relatively small, black and white images that kind of like running the gamut of the way that I kind of approach things. It's, you know, some work is done from direct observation, some from photographs, some from imagination, some from combinations of things like that, and using different materials that I haven't really worked with in the past to try to just kind of reboot and kind of restart a way of kind of examining things. So they originally were intended to be studies for larger pieces, but then as the studies, and they weren't like tiny little thumbnails, but they were, you know, 9 by 12 or 11 by 17 kind of pieces. I started realizing that those are the works. And so it's a series that right now I think is up to 45 images. And so I'm getting ready to, it's a lot. And so I'm getting ready to try to figure out like how to sort of consolidate them, whether if it's digital, if it's a series of prints, you know, things like that.
Are you going to show that work like in a gallery?
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah. So now it's like also for the past few years, I mean, also with COVID too, when you had exhibition venues shut down and galleries closed and things like that. But then also even prior to that, I was sort of out of the sort of extricating myself from the gallery world a little bit. And so now it seems like it's a world I want to really kind of get back into, that communication, like having a body of work that I feel sort of has an opening and a closing. And so could really see that as a definitive body of work, and then have that presented real time as images, but then also not real time if it's digital format, or if it's, printed limited edition or something like that. And so I'm looking into ways of more broadly disseminating that.
All right. Well, that's awesome.
Cool.
That sounds really good. I bet those drawings are cool.
They're fun. I mean, some of them are kind of cool, and some are kind of disasters, but then I'm like kind of responding more to the disasters in some ways, which is kind of fun. But
okay. Yeah, that sounds really cool. Well, I'm sure you'll post about it when that show will be up and everything, because I would like to see this work as well.
Cool.
All right. So thank you, Michael, for joining me. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your words. Thank you for your thoughts. Thank you everyone for joining us. Feel free to let Michael and I know what you think of this conversation in the comments section. Also, I invite you to subscribe to my audiovisual channel, because more of these conversations are coming. I also invite you to like this video and share it with any and all pertinent individuals. If you want to support Michael, myself, this podcast, or all three, the links will be in the show notes. So thank you very much, everyone, and see you next time. Bye.